Gavin Martin from Cornerstone Wealth joins us today at the start of our budget coverage to help us actually get our heads around some of the things that have been discussed in last night's budget. Gavin, good morning.
Good morning, Matt. How are you this morning?
I'm doing well. Quite an interesting look at the federal budget last night as Wayne Swan presented his latest offerings to the people of Australia. A few interesting things I thought we could start with, though, Gavin. One of the things that the Treasurer kept talking about was that the projections that they had of being a $1 billion surplus have gone completely out of the window as of last year, and we're now at an $18 billion deficit. How do we move from $1 billion over to $18 billion under when we're budgeting?
Yeah, really good question. And they attribute it all to revenues. And now it's not actual revenues it's not that the economy has shrunk. The economy has grown by 6%. It's that the projections weren't as they were supposed to. The projections they had this time last year just didn't turn out. And that was the question when we were chatting last year. That we had. How can we actually believe these figures? And that was the point, that the revenue figures didn't actually turn out the way they were supposed to.
One of the other things that the Treasurer was saying is that our economy is actually 13% larger than before the global financial crisis.
Yeah, exactly. It's grown, it's bigger, but it's not as big as what we had hoped or what Treasury predicted over the last several budgets.
Also, Gavin, what do they mean by a AAA credit rating? Now, I've heard this term bandied around so much, especially in the last 12 months where they're between the two budgets, talking about Australia still has a AAA credit rating from the major banks in the world, and yet here we are looking at an $18 billion deficit and a debt level that is far more than that.
Yeah, a AAA credit rating is really just your ability to pay your debt. And whilst I think the government and Wayne Swan was articulated in a lot of the documents and even last night, how when you compare Australia to many economies around the world, Japan, the US, we have got a lot lower debt ratio than those other nations, and particularly some European nations. So we will probably peak out at about $300 billion of debt, but we're still only about 17-18% of our total income, which in global terms is very low. But when you look at what we were maybe 6 years ago, it's not as good as it was then.
Well, how does it work then? If we're so far in debt, I mean, like if I was so far in debt like that, there's no way I'd be able to get a loan to help myself continue to live. It would be a matter of, okay, well, you've got to do something about it. You'd be declared bankrupt or something like that. And yet here we have a national economy that is in debt but isn't declared bankrupt.
Yeah, it's in debt, but we can all service a level of debt. It's just how much debt that is. So $300 billion of debt that we're likely to have in a couple of years' time is very much serviceable. But the challenge is how to get on a path to reduce that debt. And that's what the big question mark is. It's going to be tough for this government, and it'll be tough if there's a new government that comes in later in the year as well. It's a really hard task to start to reduce that debt.
Now, some of the things that Treasurer Swan have looked at to reduce that debt, he has made it very clear that the focus for this particular budget was things like education, jobs, infrastructure, and the biggest one, he said, was growth. And a lot of different things that the government is throwing money at, but also taking money away and tightening the belt a bit. So let's have a look at some of those. First off, let's look at the tightening the belt measures. There's been a lot of talk from the Treasurer about closing tax loopholes and taking away things like the baby bonus, but increasing the family tax benefit. How does that work as a belt tightening measure?
Yeah, it's interesting because in the budget, for every dollar that was a spending cut, there are $3 worth of tax increases. So there's a bit of an argument that they should actually be focusing a little bit more on spending cuts rather than revenue or tax increases. But as you say, yeah, one of the big ticket items was the baby bonus, and they've almost shuffling the numbers a little bit here because they are getting rid of the baby bonus 1st of March next year, giving people 9 months to, I think someone said that they've got about 10 days to fall pregnant. But they're getting rid of the baby bonus, but they're putting in a smaller type of baby bonus just within the family tax benefit system. So it's reducing from first child it's currently $5,000, reducing to $2,000, and for a second child it's going from $3,000 down to $1,000.
And how's that going to affect families, Gavin?
I think it will have a large impact on families, and particularly those planning to have children or further children or more children. It's part of the budget measures that they do need to make some cuts. It's just a matter of where those cuts come from.
One of the other things that has been a big ticket item has been the Medicare levy, the increase in the Medicare levy as of July, which the Treasurer said last night is going to go into a special fund that in the future will fund the National Disability Insurance Scheme. How does this work? Do you know, Gavin?
Yes, so from July 2014, the Medicare levy will increase by 0.5%, so it will go from 1.5% to 2%, and that's going to be set aside for the disability scheme. The disability scheme isn't going to start for a little while, so that pool of money is supposed to be, I guess, put aside for that purpose. So I think over the projections, the 0.5% increase in the Medicare levy is going to accrue more money than actually is required for the disability scheme. So that they are getting a good result in terms of their income or the government's revenue in that respect. Also,
one of the other things that we said, education was a big focus for the Treasurer in this budget, looking at school funding and looking at access to universities. $97 million of Commonwealth funding for university placements. What does that mean?
Yeah, there's a significant funding in the university space, but the larger amount is really going into school education, so primary, secondary school education with the Gonski reforms. And so that's, a typical budget, as Wayne called it, where he's focusing on education and disability, and also they've spent $24 billion on roads and rail as well.
Yeah, that's a pretty big deal, though. That goes into what the Treasurer was talking about with infrastructure spending, especially after the floods in Queensland and New South Wales last year. They're putting a lot of money into the likes of the Pacific Highway in New South Wales and the Bruce Highway in Queensland, but also funding bridges and other roads across the country.
Yeah, tunnels down in Melbourne. There's a bit of conjecture about whether they should be spending that money in Melbourne on tunnels for roads or whether they should be spending it on public transport. But yeah, it's a good infrastructure spending is pretty hard to argue against. It's not a bad way to invest a nation's resources.
And rural communities also going to be happy to hear that there's a lot of funding going towards water, towards farming communities, and just maintaining the mental health of farming communities in general.
Yeah, an important measure at this point in time where people are still struggling with drought conditions and really tough environment in farming and regional communities at the moment.
Biggest disappointment, though, I thought, Gavin, was the look at jobs. Now, the Treasurer is talking a lot about jobs and encouraging people to get into work, throwing some money at the aviation industry, about small business and entrepreneur activities, and yet hasn't really had any clear incentives there in the budget for programs to help people get into work and support them while they're out of work.
Yes, they have. The key issue there for people on New Start, those people who haven't got employment and are needing support from the government, the New Start allowance is very low and very tough to get by on, and there's been, a lot of petitioning to increase that. They haven't actually increased the New Start allowance, but what they're going to do is allow people on New Start to increase or to earn another $1,000 before it starts to reduce their New Start allowance. And I guess the question is there, if they can't get a job, they can't get that other $1,000, but I guess it's in trying to encourage them in people looking for work in the right direction by getting at least some work and it not reducing their allowance there.
Do you think that might mean an increase in casual and part-time jobs and not full-time wages, where people are really desiring that full-time and that, clarification and security that a full-time job offers?
Yeah, I think that's a trend globally, that workforces are moving to more casual and flexible arrangements with employees. And so unfortunately, even though it's not the desire of a lot of people, that's just the way things are moving, and that's the way the world is working.
Overall, Gavin, what are your perceptions as a financial planner, as someone who's giving advice to people on how to spend their money wisely? How do you think this budget stacks up for the general person in the community?
Yeah, there's not too many handouts in this particular budget. It's very much an election or a typical election budget, but it might be an election budget of sorts in that it's encouraging us to try to look forward and think about, or they're trying to paint the picture of economic responsibility. But I guess it's not what we've seen in the last 6 years. And I guess a government is just like a family in that they need to try and balance the books. They need to start to reduce debt over time in a responsible way, just like we as families need to ensure that we aren't spending more than we earn and that we are actually paying down debt over time as well. So overall, a budget that we needed to have, that we need to tighten things up a little bit, but whether it can be met, whether we can get back to surplus in the 3 or 4 years projected, is the bigger question.
And do you think that that is possible, looking at the way that the Treasurer has said this is what they're going to do, this is how they're going to do it? Is his 5-year plan to return Australia's budget to surplus doable?
Oh, it's hard to think that it is doable based on the fact that we last year thought we were going to be a $1.5 billion surplus, and now it's a $19 billion deficit. And we're very much reliant on China's growth to make sure that their earnings are okay. And we also need to see growth throughout the rest of the Australian economy, not just the resources boom. We need to see growth consistently across the economy to see these figures come to fruition.
Well, it'll be interesting to see what the opposition reply will be tomorrow night. Gavin Martin, for now, thanks so much for your contribution and helping us get our heads around it.
My pleasure, Matt. Great to be with you.